Noroi, The Curse, is a Japanese movie from 2005, directed by Koji Shiraishi. And Lake Mungo is a 2008 Australian movie set around 2005, directed by Joel Anderson. They're both heavily grounded and atmospheric horror films in the faux documentary style with possible supernatural elements. Though Noroi is a found footage style film following a paranormal investigator, and Lake Mungo is a more straight up fake documentary about a family. Both came pretty highly recommended to me by people whose opinions on horror film I respect, and I watched both for the first time very recently with other people, which I would suggest versus watching either of these alone, but just for the fun of a shared film experience, and also so that you don't have to watch them alone, as they're both really scary. I wanted to review the two movies together because they have a lot of commonalities and a lot of strong differences. Formal differences, and differences stemming from each film's cultural background. And because I would love to get more people to watch both of them, as they're both really good. Both uncommonly well-constructed and effective horror movies. This video will not have any spoilers for either movie, and I would say don't look up anything about these movies before you have a chance to watch them either. Not so much out of worry for narrative plot spoilers, but because both have really strong, unique horror imagery. That's going to be more impactful if you can see it in context versus on a YouTube thumbnail or whatever. Like, don't even watch the Noroi trailer, it gives a whole lot of it away. I saw Noroi first, and I saw it thanks to my friend David, who I make video games with. I have a group of friends I've been watching Lupin the Third media together with on Zoom calls during lockdown, and Noroi was David's suggestion for our Halloween group viewing. It has nothing to do with Lupin the Third, but we're all horror film nerds, so it worked out. Noroi has some pretty subtle dry humor and some subtle social satire and satire of Japanese TV shows, but it's still primarily a sad and disturbing supernatural horror film where strange incidents start piling up and then rapidly escalate. All of the weirdness is heavily grounded by its main character, Kobayashi. Kobayashi's fun to watch and charming as a protagonist, but his personality is also pretty dry and matter-of-fact. And you're watching him step by step methodically investigate some weird, scary supernatural incidents. The pieces of his investigation act as building blocks to a horror story with an in-depth and complex mythology to it, involving a large cast of characters that are all vividly realized. This gives the movie a solid grounding, and even as the horror escalates, lends it believability and verisimilitude, and sometimes humor, whether from playing with the Ghost Hunter show format or the characters themselves. Much of the horror in Noroi, especially towards the beginning, is implied, but what's implied is a kind of imagined body horror, a cosmic horror, the horror of tapping into something that has always existed all around you, but that you shouldn't have tapped into. And in this movie and in Lake Mungo, there's so much that seems innocuous at first, but is given very creepy, darker meaning as the movie goes on. Lake Mungo was recommended to me by a bunch of people, including people in my Lupin Watch group, and was also a movie my mom and brother had watched together and liked, and thought I would like, so I watched it with my family. Both when I tweeted asking for people to tell me the scariest movie they'd ever seen, and when I tweeted later that I had just watched it for the first time, I got a pretty big and interesting response from those who had seen Lake Mungo, including, "The damage this movie did to my soul is palpable. Lake Mungo is the only film to ever make me actually scream in fright. Lake Mungo absolutely destroys my ability to think cohesively, genuinely disturbed me in a way few horrors can. Lake Mungo is the scariest movie I've ever seen, no question. This movie has hands down the most unsettling scene of any film ever, and it haunted me for weeks after. I lost my brother, and no film encapsulated the sheer horror and weirdness of grief as this one. The one problem with Lake Mungo is that when I talk about Lake Mungo, it makes my brain think of that one image from the movie, and it causes psychic damage. The most recent one that got to me at all was Lake Mungo, which was kinda goofy, but the feelings of doom and depression really stuck with me. Incredibly sad movie, very effective at what it did. That film messed me up for weeks. I couldn't sleep with the lights turned off in my bedroom for a long time afterward, and maybe my favorite, Lake Mungo is incredible. Good lord, that movie seeps into me." Lake Mungo is much less elaborate than Noroi, both narratively and as far as the complexity of its mythos, if you want to call it mythos. It centers on an Australian family, 2 teenage kids and their parents, and the strange situation they find themselves in after the teenage girl in the family drowns. It's also much more about grief, what grief does to a family, the mindset of grief, the desperation of grief, and it's more subtle than Noroi. I don't mean it's better than Noroi, honestly it's just apples and oranges. Noroi, with its ectoplasmic worms and goofy psychic TV shows, an increasingly desperate and terrified cast of characters, versus Lake Mungo, mostly made up of calm, evenly paced interviews with a grieving family interspersed with some of the strangest and saddest and most genuinely disturbing horror concepts I've ever come across. Like Mungo reminds me of a Junji Ito story, but stripped down, stripped of the flashier and weirder imagery to the bare fear and dread. It has a heavy Lynch and Twin Peaks influence as well. The family's last name is Palmer, and some of the plot, like Twin Peaks, has to do with what Alice hid from her family when she was alive, and you get that mundane horror of missed opportunities for connection with a loved one, and of secrets kept, and so on, along with the weirder, less mundane, uncanny horror in the movie. Both of these movies aren't super obscure in the horror film fan community, but seemed obscure enough outside of that to warrant a little spotlight video on my end, even if only to try to get more people to watch them. Noroi doesn't have an American Blu-ray or DVD release and was only available on streaming in the US this year, and like Mungo's director hasn't really made anything else, and as far as I can tell went pretty off the grid after making this movie. Both of them are so scary and get under your skin so deeply, and it's so cool looking at them side by side because they're so different tonally and come from such different points of view culturally, but have a lot of similarities formally, like in how they're constructed as horror films, and plot-wise. Both involve a body of water as a central element to the story. Both involve psychics coming in to help. Both are presented as mockumentary rather than that haphazard style of found footage. That's just a bunch of random footage strung together. It's kind of the lazier style of like, why would there even be a camera there? Both deal a lot with the meeting of recording technology and the supernatural. Maybe in a way only movies from this time period could, before consumer recording technology was as advanced as it is now. Noroi is realistic, but it's more colorful and vibrant in its characters, and after the interweaving plots have built to a certain point, has scare after scare after scare, leading up to a crescendo. While Lake Mungo is much more understated, with creepy scenes here and there leading up to something calmer, but unspeakable, and really haunting. Both are so sad, too. My Hereditary review is my favorite review I've written, and while I didn't want to get as personal in this one, I should say both Lake Mungo and Noroi are in the same league as Hereditary, as far as being well-crafted, disturbing horror films about something beyond your control, impacting, hurting you and the people around you. The concept of there maybe being something out there that's just as much a part of the natural world as you are, as the water is, as trees and dirt and rocks and the air are, but you don't understand it. And even though not understanding it is to your detriment, maybe you don't want to understand it. Maybe it's at once too sad and too horrific to deal with. Though with Lake Mungo, I'd say at the outset there's a lot of ambiguity as to whether a supernatural element is at play versus something just as terrible but more mundane, and I'll leave it to you to watch it and see how that plays out. Lake Mungo is really interesting to me in how it portrays certain specificities of grief, especially around grieving someone who left a disfigured corpse. Grief rituals in different parts of the world and at different times and according to different religious beliefs can vary widely. But in my culture, viewing a body at a visitation or funeral is very important for closure, and having had a family member die who was then unviewable and disfigured, similar to the way the young girl Alice is in this film, I think gave me a different feeling or a different perspective watching this movie than I might have had otherwise, and in a way I'm still processing. You don't get the same explosive rifts you get in Hereditary here, but the calm and stoic nature of the family in Lake Mungo doesn't make their pain any less excruciating or relatable. Noroi is less about grief, but still has really terrible stuff happen to undeserving people, a theme all three movies have in common. For both Lake Mungo and Noroi, you need to have an open mind, and you have to be willing to be an empathetic viewer and to let horror in. Horror is subjective, and if you see these movies are Hereditary and they don't scare you at all, that's fine. One thing I thought was really interesting about me asking on Twitter for the scariest movies people had seen was some of the answers of films that had scared people replying terribly, were movies I thought were stupid or not scary at all. But that's not a mark against people who got creeped out by them, it just means we're different and scared by different media. I'm not insecure enough to see horror film as a contest of bravery, and to refuse to let anything scare me or refuse to admit something has scared me. I also don't want to watch extreme horror films that are nothing but nihilistic, borderline snuff films. I don't get any enjoyment out of those movies the same way I don't look at shock sites or ISIS beheading videos. Like I've never seen Cannibal Holocaust because I don't want to watch a turtle die. But while it has really extreme content, Man Bites Dog is a movie I've seen several times and one of my favorite movies ever because it's a nuanced critique of media violence, not a simplistic, base, how nasty can we get movie. Noroi and Lake Mungo aren't extreme in the sense of just pushing the worst of humanity on the viewer to force a reaction. Instead, they both skillfully tweak something deep inside of you as a viewer. Like something haunting you noticed in an old photograph you found but didn't even know you had, or some kind of repressed memory you're suddenly brought back to. I mentioned the dates these movies came out or were set in at the beginning of this review because 2005 is the year a bunch of my relatives died. And it's just a weird, creepy coincidence for me that both movies involved that year in some way. Like Alice dies in 2005 and Noroi came out in 2005. One time my brother and I were cleaning out my dad's car after he had been dead for years, and we found this photo of him and my great-grandmother, who died right before he did, and maybe some other relatives. We live in Georgia and the summers are really, really hot and humid here, and probably because of that, the image of the photo was warped by time, or it was like a disposable camera photo. It was warped by the heat. It was like blackened, and their faces were warped on part of it. It looked very strange and felt like a hindsight omen or something, like it was probably in this car when he died, but we didn't find it until way later when it was all distorted. My brother and I kind of laughed about it, like, ooh, creepy. And also the car had a wasp's nest in it, so we got out and made my mom spray the car with bug spray, and we were like dodging wasps while picking through it. I hadn't thought about that in ages, but that's part of the vibe of these movies to me, if you can imagine that experience. Weird, nasty little surprises, distorted images, and little pockets of grief and strange circumstances hidden just out of view, with something really upsetting, something really tragic underlying it. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, and if you have a pretty high spooky tolerance, these are two of the most frightening movies I've ever seen. There was a point towards the end of Noroi where everyone on our Zoom call was completely silent for like half an hour because we were so freaked out and so engaged, and like Mungo seemed even creepier and more upsetting on rewatch for my relatives than it had been when they first saw it, then check both of them out. They're actually both pretty easy to find right now, versus a few years, especially for Noroi, it's much easier to find now than it used to be. It's on Shudder. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please consider donating to me on Patreon or Ko-fi, so I can keep making videos like this one. Check out my Hereditary review. I talk a lot about a horror film and grief in that one as well, probably more in depth than this video. It wasn't too difficult to talk about Noroi and like Mungo without spoilers, because you could just talk about the vibes. They're both really scary, and are both so upsetting and so disturbing, and you don't really have to talk about plot specifics or even specifics of imagery to get into that. But I think if you've seen them, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about more, and if not, I highly recommend checking them out, unless you're really, really sensitive to horror movies, and then they might not be the ones to check out. Because, both of them really got under my skin, but I think, like everyone else that was responding on Twitter, there are some shots in Lake Mungo that just stay with you, which is impressive, especially for a movie that it's not like torture porn or whatever. I don't want to fully disparage something like torture porn, but I just hate Eli Roth. I hate everything he stands for, and I like extreme horror movies that are exploring adult, disturbing concepts, but not just, let's see how much tendon cutting and violence we can cram into one movie and call it horror. I don't know. Anyway, thank you for watching.